Hi everybody, and welcome to Guidestone's High Altitude Garden Series. I'm Monica Pless. I'm the Farm to School Director here at Guidestone, Colorado in Salida. And today's topic is about growing herbs and some easy herbs to grow at home. So I'll talk about some of our culinary herbs that are annuals, culinary herbs that are perennials, a few easy tea herbs, and then a little bit at the end about how we like to dry herbs. And we'll include a couple sort of 200 level herbs that I feel like are easier to grow if you have an indoor space, but that might even just be your windowsill or a potted plant at your house. So we'll start here. This is one of our herb beds. This one has, closest to me, it has the cilantro. In the middle it has some chive. And on the far side it has flowering oregano. So oregano is a perennial. A lot of the Mediterranean herbs actually do fairly well with a relatively dry climate. You can almost feel a little bit of that waxiness on their leaves. And one of the ways, if I'm not sure how wet or what kind of conditions a plant likes, is I think about where it comes from. And so Mediterranean climate is cool and rainy in the winter, although it doesn't get super cold. And it is fairly dry and sunny during the summer. So some of the things we've done more to try and emulate that, and some of them we just grow and see how they do. So this one is actually probably wetter than I would ideally make it for oregano, but it seems to be doing fine. In the middle we have chives. Chives like it much wetter. They're in the onion family, so that's why you get that really oniony smell. And then on the right side here we have cilantro. So a couple things I wanted to mention about cilantro. Cilantro is in the same family as parsley, as fennel, as dill. It's a really diverse family of annual cooking herbs. And so while chives and oregano are perennials and you kind of really need to plant them one year and really start harvesting them a year or two later, cilantro you can plant many times throughout the year. It's hardy to frost, so it's a good one to have even in a outdoors in a garden. Even it'll last past the first several frosts. To get it really through the heart of the winter, you probably want to have some kind of hoop house. One fun thing about cilantro that we'll see in a second is that the seeds of it are another herb that you might know called coriander. So you can save the seeds as seeds for next year, or you can save the seeds to add that to your spice rack as well. Let's go this way and we'll see some of our salve and tea herbs. So there's a lot of teas, and sometimes people make teas out of things that are often considered culinary herbs. So you can make a really nice rosemary tea. Lavender, which is closely related to rosemary, is another herb that's kind of a crossover. It can either be used for teas or salves, or often also used in culinary purposes. In this bed we have some lavender. Lavender is a tender perennial, so that means that it will overwinter. It won't die at the very first frost, but it often has a hard time living through the winter here. We're in zone 5B, which is fairly cold. I think our coldest temperatures are often in maybe -10. This is the lavender. When you look at it as a plant, it looks very similar to rosemary. And so ways that we try and overwinter it, that's why you can still see there's a lot of mulch around here, because one way you can help to overwinter it, if your wintertime temperatures dip down pretty low, is to mulch it really heavily. Because we are in such a dry climate, we also water it some over the winter, and we don't have our irrigation system on over the winter, so it just means that every month or so I try and water it, especially if it hasn't had a lot of snow. If there's a lot of snow, it's probably fine. Another herb that we have over here, right on the edge, this is chamomile. Chamomile is another really easy annual to grow. You literally pick off the flower heads, you dry those, and that's what you can use as tea. Chamomile is a really nice herb. It's very calming, so if your little ones are kind of getting a little rambunctious and you want to help calm them down a little bit, you can give them some chamomile tea. We're going to keep going this way. So we also grow some of our herbs in more of a farm system where we grow them in our raised beds. So that's mostly true of things that we grow a lot of, which I would say our 4 big herbs for our CSA or for our school district or hospital accounts are parsley, basil, cilantro, and dill. So those are the 4 that we mostly grow in beds. This is a bed of parsley. Parsley we transplanted. We probably seeded it at the very beginning of April and we transplanted it in May. And it takes a little while for parsley to grow, but once it grows, it's a hardy annual. So we can often overwinter it all the way through the winter in our high tunnel. You might even be able to overwinter it a little bit outside, although the quality of it might go down a little bit if it goes through that many freeze and thaw cycles. So it's a really lovely fresh herb to have for that. Cilantro and dill are also quite hardy herbs. They are also things that we can have in the high tunnel with no additional heat, just a little bit of extra solar sun to keep it warm, and they will go all the way throughout the winter. Over here we have another perennial herb bed. You can also see that it's been mulched. We have sage. Sage tolerates dry conditions probably the best. It's a great herb. And then we also have some thyme. Thyme and sage are also both perennials, and so when you start them the first year, it's best to let them get established for a year or so before you really start picking them. A general rule of thumb about perennials, not just from herbs, is that when you plant them out, the first 3 years are sleep, creep, leap. So the first year, it will almost not seem like it's growing at all. It's just sort of maintaining. Really, a lot of the work is underground, establishing those roots that are gonna help it live through consecutive seasons. The second year, it sleeps, or it creeps, so it starts to grow, but not a ton. And then in the third year, it really is when it starts growing much more prolifically. We also want to we have actually quite a wet piece of land here, so although we don't get a lot of water, the piece of land we have is quite wet and has a pretty high water table, so we also wanted to use this really wet area. This is a little swale that has a little drainage in it, and so we're growing things that like it wet. So one of them is mint. Mint is also a perennial. It likes it wet. It will spread pretty aggressively, and so make sure that it's in a place where you're fine with it spreading. From here, it could go into grass on one side or grass on the other side, and if the mint spreads into the grass, I'm fine with that. We've also planted it through wood chips and also laid down some cardboard here to try and help mostly contain it over here. We also have some lemon balm. Lemon balm is a very lemony, often used for tea, and it's in the mint family, like many of these herbs are, and it also likes it fairly wet. So that's another one that we felt like we could incorporate over here into the swale. So now we're gonna go into our dome greenhouse, and we'll talk a little bit about some more tender herbs. So tender herbs means that they probably won't make it through the winter in our climate for sure. Some of them might make it through the winter in a little bit more tropical or warmer climate. There's some that we don't have here that I'm hoping to add in. One is roselle. Roselle, or hibiscus, is a relative of okra that's often used for this really beautiful red tea. It's quite tart, and it will live outside here, but it probably wouldn't produce much, so it's one of the things that we'll probably try and put into our dome next year. And some of the other things that we haven't gotten into the dome yet, because we just put up these beds today, are stevia, which is a really sweet herb and it doesn't actually contain any sugar, but it can be grown. It's fairly tender to frost, so you have to keep it fairly warm, but it's nice to dry it and add it into some of your tea blends. So some of the other herbs that I wanted to show you guys are dill. So this is dill that we'll be planting into the dome or into one of our high tunnels. As you can see, these transplants have been waiting to go in for a little while, so they're starting to flower. The dill flowers are also a great addition. When I make dill pickles, I often cut off a whole flower head and put one in each jar, partly because they're pretty, and then also for that great dill flavor. Dill, like cilantro, is a very easy seed to save. So when you let those flowers, you keep them going, let them go to seed, you can save those seeds. And we'll talk a little more about seed saving next week. But so these dill, you can also direct seed dill and cilantro, just stick the seeds right in the ground. Because they do have a tendency to go to seed when it's hot, many people seed them in succession. So maybe every 3 or 4 weeks, you put out another set of cilantro. So the cilantro we saw at the beginning of this class had already gone to seed. It has white flowers. So we already have out in the back 9, a little bit further, a new planting of cilantro that's now just 3 or 4 inches tall. And that's what we're harvesting off of for our accounts right now. With chives and garlic chives, you also can seed them. They are perennial, so make sure that you put them in a place where you want to have them for multiple years. I find it's helpful to seed them in the greenhouse and transplant them out, because when they first start, they're often very, very thin, and they're easy to get a little bit swallowed up by weeds. They're also fairly easy to save seed from, and so sometimes that'll mean that you have your chives are really spreading. When we want to establish more sage, we do also start that from seed. Most of these I probably start in late March or early April in the greenhouse. And like I said, sage is a perennial, so when I plant this into the ground, I'm not going to take a lot off of it this year. I'm going to wait for it to establish, and then I can start doing small harvests at first and then larger harvests later. This is rosemary, so you'll see it looks a lot like lavender. They're very closely related. It's important then to make sure that you label these, although the nice thing with herbs is if you lose a label, you can usually smell them and figure out which one they are. Rosemary, like lavender, is a tender perennial. We'll probably actually plant this in the dome because I would love to have some fresh herbs to offer to the school district throughout the year. And rosemary is one that they often can use. It's a great one also if you want to have some in a container. In places where it doesn't get as cold, like my aunt in the Pacific Northwest is always asking me, how do you keep your rosemary contained or like in check? And well, that's not really our issue here because we don't have such a mild climate that it keeps growing and growing. Although it will be something that we have to do in the dome, and we'll cut it back pretty significantly if it starts to really take over an area. But for right now, I think rosemary taking over an area feels like a pretty good problem to have. And the last one that we already have seeded in here is an herb called shiso. This is used a lot in Korean and Japanese cooking. It's also called perilla. We have a green version and a red version. The red version is traditionally used to flavor and help dye umeboshi plums, which are like pickled plum that turn pink. And some of that color comes from the red shiso. I like growing it partly because it has a very interesting and unique flavor to me. I feel like you get notes of cinnamon and a little cumin and sort of a curry flavor. So for us, we don't have a big market for it. It's really just something that we like use with kids who come into the farm or onto one of the school gardens to try and have them think really creatively about what do you think it tastes like. And so I've heard everything from soap to Fruit Loops to cinnamon to curry. So just really trying to get people to think about what does something taste like that they might not be familiar with. So I'm going to switch with our garden educator, Elle, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about making an herb dryer from scratch.
Hello, hi. So I'm the garden educator here with Salida with Guidestone, and I wanted to show you something I made, mostly from recycled materials, which was really fun for me. I like thinking about how I can reuse stuff because I'm like, I don't want to throw this away. So this is an old bike tire, and we ended up, so a few things actually. We ended up using an old piece of wood as a stability piece of wood, and we put it in, and then we just screwed it in the inside. I also used duct tape because it was like going backwards and forwards. And then I made this during camp, so our kids helped us. And so they cut all these strings to size and tied them. And then we used some window screen for the bottom part. And so it's pretty sturdy. And I'm hoping to put like garlic on the inside. And so when we made this, we put it on the underneath so that the bike would act as basically a wall to keep anything from blowing out if it is in there. And then we made little hooks from safety pins. That's what they're called, right?
Yeah.
And so we ended up just bending them into shape, which was really fun. And the kids really liked that part. And then this is plantain hanging from here. And so when you hang things, you need to hang it in a shady spot. So we ended up putting it right under a tree. But if you look over here at this pin, we ended up just bending it, and then this was used as the hook, and then we just bent this part, and that's where we hold our herbs, which was really fun. We have another one that my roommate ended up making, and so hers is very lovely because she used staples instead of duct tape, which is what me and the kids used. Because we didn't have a staple gun, but it's just as sturdy as this. This one's a little bit more movable. This one you have to have something to hang it on. Yeah, does anybody have any questions or anything like that?
I'm going to switch back with Elle now. And just tell you a couple more things about drying. So like Elle said, it's best with herbs if you dry them outside of the direct sunlight. They will have a tendency a little bit to bleach. And if you are using a dehydrator, I have a big dehydrator at home. It has a lower setting for a lower temperature. You're kind of going for 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So you want a place that has fairly good air circulation if you're not using a dehydrator. And you don't want to put a lot of layers on there, like one thin layer of herbs to make sure that they can dry completely. When you're testing your herbs to make sure that they're dry, you want to make sure that they are really brittle. So this isn't so much of a hard thing to do here in Colorado, but you want to make sure they have a nice crackly sound. If they don't, what can happen is that they may have too much moisture in them still, and they might end up molding, rotting, and you don't want that with your herbs. And so after that, I usually try and put them actually into like a ball jar or a glass container. I also sometimes will put them at least temporarily into paper bags so that if there is any remaining moisture in them, that can still continue to evaporate. If you do have them totally dry and you're in a more humid climate, it's probably better to put them into some kind of plastic so that they don't reabsorb any of that moisture from the air. We have dried basil, sage, parsley. The cilantro does not dry well, but the coriander, the cilantro seeds do. Dill dries well, thyme, rosemary, almost all of the herbs that we use culinarily dry really well. Lavender also. And then a lot of times if we're using something for salve, we dry it completely first and then we infuse that dried herb in the oil. and that makes sure that we aren't, it's not gonna mold or rot as we make the salve. Drying also works great for a lot of the teas like mint and lemon balm and chamomile. So we hope that gives you a couple of ideas of some herbs to try. As always, if you are enjoying these and want to support Guidestone, we always appreciate it. And if you're local here in Salida and want to come down and help us out, we have volunteer mornings from 8 to noon, Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and then afternoons from 1:30 to 3 on Fridays, and our power hour on Monday evening from 5:15 to 6:15. Hope to see you sometime soon, and we'll be back next week with a session about an introduction to seed saving. Thanks so much.